The 60-story glass tower of Mitchell Technologies pierced the evening sky like a sword of innovation thrust into the heart of Silicon Valley. As sunset painted the windows in sheets of amber and gold, Sandra Mitchell stood at her top-floor office window, her reflection a ghost against the spectacular view. At 45, she still turned heads with her elegant presence, but grief had etched fine lines around her eyes that even the most expensive creams couldn't erase. 3 months had passed since John's death. 3 months of board meetings where men in $1,000 suits watched her with predatory patience, waiting for the marketing executive turned CEO to stumble. They forgot or chose to ignore that before she was John Mitchell's wife, she had built her own digital marketing empire from a laptop in her studio apartment. "I won't let them take your legacy," she whispered to the fading horizon, her manicured fingers pressing against the cool glass. The office around her hummed with cutting-edge technology, holographic displays, prototype smartphones, and artificial intelligence interfaces that wouldn't hit the market for another 5 years. This was her world now, whether the board liked it or not. The subtle whoosh of the cleaning cart's wheels brought her back to the present. Through the reflection in the window, she watched James Cooper navigate around her office with practiced efficiency. There was something different about him, something that had caught her attention over the past few weeks. While the other cleaning staff avoided eye contact, rushing through their tasks like shadows, James moved with quiet dignity. His movements were precise, almost mechanical, like someone used to handling delicate equipment rather than mops and brooms. "Evening, Mrs. Mitchell," he said, his voice carrying an unexpected hint of refinement. "Working late again." Sandra turned, studying him properly for the first time. His uniform was perfectly pressed, the name tag polished to a shine. Grey peppered his temples, but his dark eyes held a sharp intelligence that seemed at odds with the cleaning supplies he managed. "The CEO's office never sleeps," she replied, attempting a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, "especially when half the board is waiting for you to fail." "Success often comes from unexpected places," James responded, then added quickly, "If you don't mind me saying so, ma'am." Something in his tone made Sandra look closer. His hands, she noticed, bore the kind of calluses that came from typing, not manual labor. The way he glanced at her holographic display held not confusion or awe, but understanding. In that moment, standing in her pristine office 40 stories above the city, Sandra felt the first stirring of curiosity about the man who cleaned her floors. Little did she know, this seemingly ordinary evening would spark a chain of events that would shake Mitchell Technologies to its very foundation. Sometimes the biggest changes come from the smallest moments, like a CEO noticing her janitor knew more about technology than he was letting on. The morning sun hadn't yet touched the Mitchell Technologies building when Sandra arrived at her office. Sleep had become a luxury she could rarely afford, especially with the quarterly board meeting looming. Spreadsheets and performance reports cluttered her desk, each number a reminder of the impossible standards she needed to meet. Mrs. Mitchell, her assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. "The development team is reporting issues with the new AI interface. They're requesting an emergency meeting." Sandra pressed her temples, fighting back a headache. John would have known exactly what to do. He'd been the technical genius, the visionary who could spot a bug in thousands of lines of code just by glancing at it. She was the one who knew how to sell the dream, how to make people believe in innovation. Now she had to be both, and some days it felt like drowning in 2 oceans at once. "Schedule it for 10, she replied, knowing it would mean cancelling her only break of the day. Several floors below, James Cooper was finishing his night shift, his movements mechanical as his mind wandered to a different time. 8 years ago, he'd been the one holding emergency meetings, leading a team of developers at his own startup. Quantum code solutions had been his dream, his chance to revolutionize financial software. Then came the market crash of 2017, and with it, the discovery that his business partner had been cooking the books. In the span of 3 months, he lost everything: his company, his reputation, his home. The cleaning job at Mitchell Technologies hadn't been his first choice, but it had been his only choice. No tech company would hire a CEO whose firm had collapsed so spectacularly, even if he'd been cleared of any wrongdoing. At least here, surrounded by the kind of innovation he once created, he could stay connected to the world he loved. That evening, fate decided to play its hand. Sandra was working late again, her frustration evident in the way she stabbed at her keyboard. James was emptying the recycling when he heard her sharp intake of breath. "No, no, no," she muttered, panic rising in her voice. Her coffee cup had tipped, sending liquid cascading across her keyboard and into the prototype holographic interface John had been working on before his death. The device sparked ominously. Without thinking, James moved. "Mrs. Mitchell, please step back." His voice carried the authority of his former life as he quickly disconnected the power supply. With practiced efficiency, he opened the interface's casing, his fingers moving with the certainty of someone who'd built similar devices. "What are you doing?" Sandra asked, torn between concern for the prototype and fascination at the janitor's unexpected expertise. The liquid could create a short circuit in the quantum processing unit, James explained, already using his cleaning supplies in ways they weren't intended. "These units have a fail-safe, but only if you can access the emergency protocols through the base code." His fingers flew across the backup keyboard he'd connected, lines of complex code reflecting in his glasses. Sandra watched in stunned silence as James navigated the system's architecture with the ease of someone walking through their own home. Within minutes, the holographic interface hummed back to life, not just functioning but somehow running more smoothly than before. "How did you?" Sandra started, then stopped, really looking at the man before her. "You're not just a janitor, are you?" James straightened, weighing his words carefully. "We all have past lives, Mrs. Mitchell. Sometimes they're better left there." But Sandra wasn't letting this go. She'd seen the way he handled the code, the confidence in his movements. That was quantum architecture you were working with. There are maybe 50 people in the world who understand it at that level. A sad smile crossed James's face. 51. Apparently he began packing up his cleaning supplies, but Sandra stepped in front of him. "Wait, please. That interface was giving our development team fits for weeks. You fixed it in minutes. I need to know who you really are." For a moment James stood silent, the weight of his past pressing down on him. Finally he spoke, his voice quiet but steady. 8 years ago, I was James Cooper, CEO of Quantum Code Solutions. Now I'm James Cooper, night shift janitor. The first one ended badly. The second one pays the bills." Recognition flickered across Sandra's face. The quantum code collapse had been major news in the tech world, but you were cleared of all charges. Your partner was the one. "Being cleared doesn't change people's perceptions," James interrupted gently. "Sometimes it's easier to start over at the bottom than to try explaining why you fell from the top." Sandra looked at the restored prototype, then back at James. In that moment she saw something. She recognized the same determination she'd felt building her own company, the same resilience she'd needed after John's death. Here was someone who understood both the height of success and the depth of loss. "Maybe," she said slowly, "it's time for perceptions to change." Sandra hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but the voices from the break room caught her attention as she walked past late one evening. The cleaning cart outside told her James was nearby, but it was the animated discussion that made her pause. "I just don't get why the quantum interpolation keeps failing," a young voice said. Kevin Zhang, one of their newest interns. "I've tried every debugging technique in the manual." "Have you considered that the problem might not be in the code itself?" James's voice was gentle, patient. "Sometimes it's about the architecture around it." Sandra peered through the glass wall. Kevin sat at a terminal, shoulders slumped in defeat, while James leaned over, pointing at something on the screen. 2 other interns huddled nearby, watching intently. "See here," James continued. "Your quantum bits are entangled, but they're not properly synchronized. It's like trying to dance with a partner while listening to different songs." Kevin's eyes widened. "Wait, so if I adjust the timing protocol?" "Exactly," James smiled. "Try running it now." The interns gasped as the error messages disappeared, replaced by smoothly running code. "That's amazing. How did you know that?" "Let's just say I've had some experience with quantum computing," James replied, already stepping back toward his cart. "But remember, I'm just the janitor." Sandra withdrew before she was spotted, her mind racing. This wasn't the first time she'd noticed James helping the younger staff. The custodial staff had reported he often worked late, far beyond his scheduled hours, and now she knew why. The next morning brought another reminder of her mounting challenges. The quarterly board meeting was less than a week away, and the preliminary reports were concerning. Sandra sat in her office, reviewing the latest projections when her tablet chimed with an urgent message from Marcus Chen, the head of their biggest investment group. Sandra, the board's concerns are growing. The AI division is months behind schedule, our quantum computing initiative is stalling, and the market isn't going to wait forever. We need concrete solutions at next week's meeting, or we'll have to consider other options for leadership. The implied threat was clear. Sandra glanced out her window, watching the early morning sun glint off neighboring buildings. Below, she could see James arriving for his shift, carrying himself with that same quiet dignity she'd first noticed weeks ago. An idea began to form, radical, possibly career-ending, but potentially brilliant. Clara, she called to her assistant. Get me everything you can find on quantum code solutions and its collapse, and clear my afternoon schedule. The next few days passed in a blur of preparation and whispered conversations throughout the building. When Sandra requested James's personnel file and began making mysterious phone calls, the rumor mill went into overdrive. I heard she's investigating all the maintenance staff, one executive whispered to another in the elevator. My source in HR says she's lost it completely, came the response. Apparently she's background checking the janitors instead of focusing on the board presentation. The turning point came 3 days before the board meeting. Sandra sat in her office, reviewing the final pieces of her plan, when her tablet lit up with another message from Marcus. Emergency pre-meeting tomorrow at 9 a.m. The board wants to discuss contingency plans for leadership transition. Attendance mandatory. Sandra smiled, though there was steel in her eyes. She pulled up her email and began to type. Dear Mr. Cooper, your presence is required at tomorrow's executive board meeting, 9 a.m. sharp, conference room A. Professional attire will be provided. Regards. Begards, Sandra Mitchell, B. CEO, Mitchell Technologies. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Within an hour of the invitation being sent, Sandra's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Marcus was the first to call. Have you lost your mind? His voice crackled through the speaker. Inviting a janitor to a closed board meeting. The shareholders will have a field day with this. Trust me, Marcus, Sandra replied calmly. Tomorrow will be interesting. By evening, the building was buzzing with speculation. Sandra watched from her office as small groups gathered in corners, shooting glances at James as he quietly went about his work. She saw the young interns he'd helped whispering excitedly, while senior executives huddled in their offices, phones pressed to their ears. That night, as the office emptied, Sandra found James in the quantum computing lab, carefully cleaning around the sensitive equipment. Did you receive my email? She asked. James straightened, his expression unreadable. I did. Mrs. Mitchell. Sandra, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but this isn't necessary. I've made my peace with where I am. Have you? She stepped closer. Because I've spent the last week watching you solve problems that our best engineers couldn't crack. I've seen you mentor young talent that we're paying thousands to train, and I've read everything about quantum code solutions, including the innovations you developed that are still being used. Today. James's facade cracked slightly. That was a different life. No, Sandra said firmly, that's who you are. My husband built this company on one principle, putting the right people in the right places, regardless of their background. I've watched you long enough to know where you belong, and it's not pushing a cleaning cart. The board will never accept it. Sandra's smile was sharp. The board doesn't have a choice. We're facing a crisis that requires exactly your expertise. Tomorrow, you can either show them what you can do, or you can keep hiding. But I think we both know which choice John would have made. She turned to leave, then paused. The suit will be delivered to your apartment tonight. Don't be late tomorrow. And James, bring your old quantum code notebooks. I have a feeling we're going to need them. As she walked away, Sandra could feel the weight of tomorrow pressing down on her. She was betting everything, her position, her reputation, possibly the company itself, on a janitor with a past. But as she remembered the way James's fingers had flown over the keyboard, the confidence in his voice as he mentored young minds, she knew she was right. Tomorrow would either vindicate her completely or end her career. There would be no middle ground. Conference room gleamed like a gladiatorial arena, its mahogany table reflecting the morning sun that streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows. 14 board members sat in Italian leather chairs, their expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed hostility. At the head of the table, Sandra Mitchell stood with the calm of a chess player about to reveal a carefully planned gambit. "Before we begin discussing leadership transitions," Sandra said, her voice steady, "I'd like to introduce someone who has a solution to our quantum computing crisis." On cue, the door opened. James Cooper walked in, and the transformation was remarkable. The pressed charcoal suit fit him perfectly, his silver-streaked hair neatly trimmed. Gone was the hesitant posture of a janitor. In its place stood someone who looked entirely at home in a corporate boardroom. Marcus Chen's face flushed red. "Is this some kind of joke?" "Sandra, we're here to discuss serious business matters, not play games with the cleaning staff." Mr. Cooper, Sandra continued, ignoring the interruption, "Please share your thoughts on the quantum interpolation issues plaguing our AI integration." James stepped forward, placing a worn notebook on the table. For a moment he said nothing, letting the tension build. Then he spoke, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who knew exactly what he was talking about. "Your quantum computing architecture is fundamentally sound," he began, "but you're approaching the AI integration from the wrong angle. The problem isn't in the quantum bits themselves, but in how they're communicating with the classical computing systems." He turned to the digital display and, with a few quick movements, pulled up the project's core architecture. His fingers flew across the keyboard, highlighting specific sections of code. "Here, here, and here," he pointed. "You're treating quantum states like classical binary operations. It's why you're losing coherence during complex calculations. But if we implement a hybrid architecture..." James began sketching out a solution, his explanation clear and confident. The board members leaned forward despite themselves, drawn in by his obvious expertise. Even Marcus's scowl had been replaced by reluctant interest. "That's actually brilliant," Dr. Sarah Chen, their head of research, whispered. "We've been so focused on forcing quantum compliance that we never considered a hybrid approach. Implementing this would cut our AI processing time by 60% at minimum," James continued. "I've run similar systems before, though on a smaller scale, at Quantum Code Solutions." The room went deadly quiet. Marcus's eyes narrowed. "Quantum Code? The company that collapsed in 2017. You're James Cooper, that James Cooper." "Yes," James replied simply. "I am." "The same James Cooper who lost investors millions." Marcus stood, his voice rising. "Sandra, you can't be serious. This man's company was a disaster." Sandra had been waiting for this moment. She stepped forward, her heels clicking on the polished floor. Quantum Code's collapse was due to financial fraud committed by James's partner, as federal investigators confirmed. What you might not know is that the quantum architecture James developed there is still being used by major tech companies today. In fact, we've been licensing a version of it for our secondary systems. She pulled up another display, showing licensing agreements and technical specifications. "The architecture we've been paying millions to use? James created it. He's been watching us struggle with an integration problem he solved 8 years ago, all while cleaning our offices because no one would give him another chance." "This is absurd," Marcus sputtered. "Even if what you're saying is true, we can't just hire a janitor as what." Sandra's voice could have cut glass. "As a technical advisor? A system architect? Because from where I stand, we have two choices. We can either swallow our pride and accept help from someone who's proven he can solve our problems, or we can explain to our shareholders why we're months behind schedule and millions over budget because we were too proud to listen to the janitor." The room erupted in overlapping voices, arguments flying back and forth. James stood quietly, his solution still displayed on the screen behind him. Finally, Dr. Chen's voice cut through the chaos. "I want to test his solution," she declared. "Right now. If it works, I don't care if he was a janitor or the King of England. I want him on my team." Sandra smiled. "I thought you might say that." She pressed a button, and the room's sophisticated display system came to life with a direct link to their quantum computing lab. "James? Show them what you can do." For the next 20 minutes, the board watched in stunned silence as James implemented his solution in real time, his fingers dancing across the keyboard as he rewrote complex quantum algorithms with the ease of someone writing a shopping list. When the final diagnostics came back showing a 68% improvement in processing speed, Even Marcus sat back in his chair, speechless. I think Sandra said into the silence, we can table that discussion about leadership transitions. Unless anyone objects, I'd like to present my proposal for a new position, Chief Innovation Officer, reporting directly to me. She looked around the room, meeting each board member's eyes. All those in favor. One by one, hands raised. Even Marcus, after a long moment, lifted his in grudging agreement. James stood at the front of the room, his expression neutral but his eyes bright. The janitor's cart that had been his companion for the past 3 years was nowhere in sight. In its place stood a man reclaiming his true identity, ready to revolutionize quantum computing once again. The initial shock of James's demonstration had worn off, and now the Mitchell Technologies boardroom crackled with tension. Marcus Chen paced near the window, his reflection fragmenting across the city skyline behind him. Impressive coding doesn't erase history, he declared, turning to face the room. Quantum codes collapse cost investors over $200 million. The market hasn't forgotten, and neither have our shareholders. Several board members nodded in agreement. James stood quietly at the end of the table, his hands clasped behind his back, dignity intact, despite the verbal assault. What about our reputation? Patricia Reynolds, head of investor relations, chimed in. The media will have a field day with this. Failed tech CEO returns as janitor, gets promotion. It sounds like a tabloid headline. Sandra had expected this resistance. She rose slowly from her chair, commanding attention without saying a word. The morning sun caught her wedding ring as she placed both hands on the polished table. Let me tell you about reputation, she began, her voice low but intense. When I started my first company, I was a 24-year-old marketing graduate working out of a studio apartment. Every venture capitalist in Silicon Valley told me I didn't have the right background, the right connections, the right anything. But John Mitchell saw something else. He saw potential. She clicked a button, and the display behind her came to life with Mitchell Technologies' stock performance over the past decade. John built this company on one principle: talent trumps traditional credentials. He hired high school dropouts who turned out to be coding prodigies. He gave chances to people others had written off, and every single time his faith was rewarded. But the room was silent now, all eyes fixed on Sandra. You're worried about our reputation. I'm worried about our soul. What does it say about Mitchell Technologies if we'd rather fail proudly than succeed with someone who's proven their worth twice over? Once by building revolutionary quantum architecture, and again by having the humility to start over from the bottom when life knocked him down. Just then, Clara burst into the room, tablet in hand. Mrs. Mitchell, I'm sorry to interrupt, but Mr. Yamazaki is on an urgent video call from Tokyo. The board members stirred uneasily. Hiroshi Yamazaki was the CEO of their largest potential client, a Japanese tech giant whose partnership could make or break their next quarter. Sandra barely hesitated. Put him through. The main display flickered to life, showing Yamazaki's stern face. Mrs. Mitchell, I apologize for the interruption, but we've just reviewed your quantum computing proposal, and I have concerns. Marcus shot Sandra a smug look, but she kept her focus on the screen. Mr. Yamazaki, we were just discussing some innovative improvements to that proposal. Would you allow us to share them? Without waiting for objections, Sandra nodded to James. Mr. Cooper, please explain your hybrid architecture solution to Mr. Yamazaki. James stepped forward, and something remarkable happened. As he began explaining his solution, his voice took on a quiet authority that commanded attention. He spoke about quantum computing not just as a technician, but as a visionary who could see its future. Yamazaki's expression shifted from skepticism to interest, then to excitement. This is remarkable, he interrupted. This architecture, it reminds me of the quantum code protocols we tried to acquire years ago before. Before my company's collapse, James finished quietly. Yes, Mr. Yamazaki. I'm that James Cooper. The Japanese CEO leaned forward, a smile breaking across his face. Cooper-san, we always wondered where you had gone. Your quantum interpolation methods were years ahead of their time. We still use modified versions of your protocols in our systems. He turned to Sandra. Mrs. Mitchell, if you are telling me that Mitchell Technologies now has James Cooper leading your quantum division, then I am prepared to double our initial investment. Send me the revised proposal by tomorrow. The video call ended, leaving the boardroom in stunned silence. Marcus had stopped pacing, his face a mix of disbelief and calculation. Patricia Reynolds was already typing frantically on her tablet, probably reworking press releases in her head. Sandra looked around the room, meeting each board member's eyes. Still worried about our reputation? Sometimes the biggest risk is not taking one at all. James Cooper doesn't just understand our technical challenges, he's already solved them once before. He has the expertise we need, the vision we've been lacking, and something you can't put on a resume. The hard-won wisdom that comes from falling down and getting back up. She turned to James, extending her hand. So, Mr. Cooper, will you help us revolutionize quantum computing again? This time with the full support of Mitchell Technologies behind you. James looked at her offered hand, then at the board members who had just minutes ago been questioning his worth. His voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of every flaw he'd mopped, every slight he'd endured, and every dream he'd kept alive. Mrs. Mitchell, he said, grasping her hand firmly, I believe we have some revolutionary work to do. The transformation was complete. In that handshake, the janitor's uniform was shed forever, replaced by the mantle of innovation and leadership that had always been his true calling. 6 months after James Cooper's appointment as Chief Innovation Officer, Mitchell Technologies had transformed in ways no one could have predicted. The morning sun still painted the 60-story building in sheets of gold, but inside everything had changed. The quantum computing division, once plagued by delays and technical issues, now hummed with unprecedented efficiency. James's hybrid architecture had not only solved their immediate problems, but had opened doors to innovations they hadn't thought possible. The Yamazaki partnership had exceeded all expectations, and 3 other major tech companies had signed contracts after hearing about their breakthrough quantum integration methods. But the real transformation went deeper than technical achievements or financial success. It showed in the way people moved through the building, in the energy that filled every floor. Where once there had been rigid hierarchies and closed doors, now there was collaboration and open communication. James had insisted on keeping his old office not the janitor's closet, but the break room where he'd helped countless interns with their coding problems. He'd turned it into an innovation hub, its walls covered with whiteboards filled with complex quantum equations and ambitious ideas. Any employee, from senior engineer to maintenance staff, could walk in with a question or suggestion. The best ideas, he often said, come from unexpected places. Sandra watched this transformation from her top-floor office, satisfaction warming her heart. The board members who had once doubted her judgment now praised her vision. Marcus Chen had become one of James's strongest supporters, especially after their quantum computing breakthrough made headlines in every tech publication. One evening, as the sunset painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, Sandra found James in his innovation hub, surrounded by a group of eager young programmers. He was explaining quantum entanglement using 2 coffee cups and a napkin, his eyes bright with the same passion she'd first noticed when he was fixing her broken prototype. Teaching the next generation, she asked after the impromptu class dispersed. James smiled, gathering up his makeshift teaching props. Everyone deserves a chance to learn, regardless of their position or background. I learned that lesson the hard way. We all did, Sandra replied, thinking of her own journey. But some lessons are worth the price. But they walked together to the window, looking out over the city that had seen both their rises, falls, and resurrections. The cleaning crew was starting their evening rounds, and Sandra noticed how James nodded to each of them with genuine respect. You know, he said thoughtfully, I used to think losing everything was the worst thing that could happen to me. But cleaning these floors taught me more about leadership than running quantum code ever did. When you're at the bottom, you see what really holds a company together. Sandra nodded. And now I understand what your husband meant about putting the right people in the right places. James turned to face her. Thank you, Sandra, not just for the position, but for seeing me when everyone else was looking through me. John would have loved this, Sandra said softly. He always said true innovation comes from seeing possibilities others miss. Speaking of which, she pulled out a tablet, showing him the latest company metrics. Employee satisfaction is up 40%. Workplace innovation submissions have tripled, and our retention rate is the highest it's been in 5 years. It's amazing what people can do when they know their worth will be recognized, James replied. As they stood there, The first stars appearing in the darkening sky, Sandra realized that Mitchell Technologies hadn't just gained a brilliant innovator, it had rediscovered its soul. In giving James Cooper a second chance, they had given everyone in the building permission to dream bigger, reach higher, and remember that every person, regardless of their position, had value and potential. The janitor's cart that had once carried James through these halls was now displayed prominently in the company museum, a reminder that sometimes the most valuable assets aren't in the boardroom, but in the hidden talents of those we pass by every day. Today, if you visit Mitchell Technologies, you'll find a quote etched in glass in the main lobby: "Innovation isn't about where you are, but who you are." Below it sits a simple janitor's cart, polished to a shine, not as a reminder of humble beginnings, but as a testament to hidden potential. The story of Sandra Mitchell and James Cooper became more than just a corporate success story. It became a lesson about seeing beyond titles and appearances, about the courage it takes to give someone a second chance, and the humility required to start over. Their partnership proved that true leadership isn't about maintaining status or protecting pride, it's about recognizing talent wherever it appears and having the wisdom to nurture it. Sometimes, the next great innovation isn't waiting in a prestigious research lab or an Ivy League graduate's resume. Sometimes, it's pushing a cleaning cart down an empty hallway, waiting for someone to look past the uniform and see the person beneath. In the end, Mitchell Technologies didn't just revolutionize quantum computing, they revolutionized the way we think about human potential. Because in a world quick to judge and slow to forgive, sometimes the greatest act of innovation is simply giving someone a chance to shine again.